Here we have an amazing panel of folks who are friends and new to the GetGlobal universe. At the end, we have Patrick Moran from Spotify. He's the global head of growth marketing, and we did a podcast with him earlier this year. It was really cool. Learned a lot about how they do things. Ben Dietz, the SVP of sales from Vice Media. And we have Elizabeth Brownson, who is the COO, executive director of Team One, which is part of Publicis, and they focus on premium and luxury. So we're talking about how do we get content out to a world of such diversity, right? Numerous platforms, numerous needs, numerous tastes. It's just, it's a huge space, and there's a lot going on in it. And you know, I think that this is probably one of those areas, one of those topics where the division between the global and local is a really important topic to think through. So I'm curious, what would you guys say are the biggest areas that you think about when you're trying to get, you know, relevant content to local cultures that, you know, may not, you need to go a little bit farther than standard sort of global or American style content. What do you think, Ben?
For us to make sure that we're getting content that is relevant in local markets, we have to ask, we have to ask people who are in the markets to make it. They have to make it in their voice, in their language, in their sort of idioms, and what we layer on is hopefully a recognizable style and a, you know, differentiated approach, which basically is tell us the story of being inside that moment, as opposed to sitting at arm's length and reporting on it from a sort of ivory tower journalism standpoint.
What about you, Patrick? I know that, you know, you're a platform, you're getting music out to folks, but your job is to make sure that they're listening to a lot of it and they're doing it enthusiastically and sharing with friends and stuff. How do you develop that sense of need and surface the content that folks really want?
So there's a couple of things in your question, right? So how do we address sort of local sort of situation of music, and then how do you get people to continue to listen to them? And I think for the most part, I think American music travels a lot, especially older nostalgic music. So I think as a hook, it's always there. But in order to be relevant, a lot of it is building significant relationships with local artists. And some of that comes through to the label relationships that we have, but a lot of that also comes to working with a lot of independents and sort of working with a lot of sort of up and coming artists and trying to find them so that they can find sort of a platform to sort of provide their music onto, right? So I think that's one part, I guess, or one an answer to the first part of your question. I think the second part of your question, in terms of surfacing that up, I think that's where the data starts to come in. So the relevancy of having a significant number of users is that you can continue to test against them and experiment against them, but and sort of learn against sort of tastes and things of that nature, to the point where you're now able to associate, you know, taste in music or taste in this song, you know, equates to potentially the taste in music of this other song, right? And so that's why we have things like, you know, daily mix and weekly mix and things of that nature. To sort of help kind of surface all of that up, to start to drive a little bit more sort of habitual behavior.
And I'm curious, so you're actually making the content, it's, you know, ranges from commercials and all kinds of content that comes from a sort of what a brand's needs and the message that it wants to get out. There's got to be a lot of challenges in that. So how do you explore that? I know that there are like cultural anthropologists that you work with. It's a really deep operation on your side.
Yeah, we do. We work. So one of the first things we try to do, especially because almost every brand we work with is global. So whether that's Lexus or whether that's HSBC Bank or the Ritz-Carlton, we work to try to figure out what is the inexorable part of the brand that you really do want to have that consistent thread through, no matter where you're going to be. You try to make sure that that's truly core of the personality of the brand that you have, no matter what. And then figuring that as like a tent pole, you work locally to figure out how, and we work locally with cultural anthropologists, with our strategy team, with our local partners. You know, we kind of have hub and spoke versions of us in different areas to say, okay, without changing this core tenet of the brand, how do we make sure that then we make it relevant to the areas, the audiences that they need to reach? And it's interesting because we've had fights with clients about what are, there's always an interesting story about, which part of your brand is the tenet that needs to be a throughway, and which are the ones that really don't resonate in local markets and can be let go of. So I think that's a lot of what we do up front. And then I think in terms of the making of it, one of the things is once those pieces are identified, I talk about kind of keeping that as the core, and when the core is really strong, it allows like the arms and legs to move quickly. And so we can then kind of mass produce, and not mass produce in any kind of derogatory way or less relevant way, but really try to focus on having a lot of content for each of the markets so that it doesn't feel just repetitive or like somebody is seeing cookie cutter versions of content for their markets.
So having seen that process play out with brands, what have you seen over time that maybe surprised you about how brands interpret themselves across markets, and what is truly core to who they are and what they're all about, and what's changeable?
I can talk. So Expedia is one of our clients, and I would tell you that the logo, the Expedia logo, that kind of like plane flying through the circle, like logo treatments, things like whether it has like a flare behind it or whether the plane flies, diagonally from 27 degrees at the bottom up to 93 degrees at the top, and all those things. The brands can become incredibly precious about and like, no, that's our thing. And we can do testing after testing after testing and say, actually, really, like, it doesn't matter whether it's moving or not. It doesn't matter whether the flare comes from the left or the right or moves. And at that point, and you're going to waste a lot of time when you have to make a lot of content, putting really tight strangleholds on exactly how you want that to look. And so there's things like that, which like testing, I always talk about data as sometimes our ticket to the shut up train, which is that, it's like, well, actually, that's really lovely that you care about that. But actually, we have this data that shows that like no one cares about that. Sometimes it still doesn't win you the battle, but it's nice to have that ticket. And I think, we do a lot of those things of kind of trying to see what it is. But there are things that are incredibly consistent. The Ritz-Carlton, even though it's really been moved into a younger demographic with us over the past 10 years, and that's been lovely, there is something about the level of service in a Ritz-Carlton. It does not matter where you are, the demographic of the luxury customer who's going there is going to expect something really kind of similar in lots of different places around the world. And in fact, that's part of what makes them comfortable coming to the Ritz-Carlton, whether it's in Moscow or whether it's in New York or whether it's in, Beijing. And that's been kind of an interesting thing to say, actually, like your logo is going to stay consistent, but actually the thing that makes people feel at home and connect with your brand is the way they're treated by the people there, and making sure that's reflected in the marketing message.
Ben, how do you take that journey at Vice Media and some of the sponsors, advertisers, folks that work with you, partners, and that you take along on the ride to resonate along with you, right? What's your perspective on that?
How do we help brands understand how to be relevant in local markets and in multiple markets?
Correct, and how you do it yourself.
Well, I mean, look, from our standpoint, we tend to believe that if a brand is coming to us and wants to reach our audience through our platforms, then they are asking for our voice, our equity, our sort of storytelling and point of view. So we try to translate that for them in ways that are as palatable as possible for their guardrails, right? And we live in a commercial environment where simply being called Vice means that we are off limits for some brands. We have 25 years of history, which is all easily Googleable, which creates brand safety issues, and we have a very particular way of working, which is sometimes hard for brands to understand because they are used to, as the spenders of money, being the single and final adjudicators of what is done. We try to challenge that in instances where we feel like things are not right or where they are going to miss an opportunity to connect with an audience because of it. And this is a little bit off topic, but it's just to give you a sense of it. Like, one of the things that we've pointed out recently is that brand safety, which, as Liz knows, is a crucial conversation within marketing and advertising, makes off limits topics like gay, lesbian, bisexual, but it's search terms: gay, lesbian, bisexual, Muslim, gun. And what that means is you can't have a contemporary conversation in which the brand is present. And as we see from the success of Nike, for instance, with the Just Do It spot recently, being present in relevant conversations is how brands drive value today. So it's just, we end up getting into a very kind of dialogic relationship with them and saying, look, we can do whatever you want, but if you want it on this platform, you should be willing to play ball, and this is how we'll keep you safe without, excluding you from opportunity.
So one thing I'm super curious about is the way that competition, right? Competition for attention. Like, there are certain platforms that they use a lot in India, others that they don't use quite so much. Same thing with China in a major way. Africa really into certain platforms and things like that. In the world of music, how do you think about the competitive landscape to be able to fit in and deliver what you want in a way that's authentic to people?
I give it 2 tries. That's as far as I was going to go. It's tough. I mean, I think from a label standpoint, they're like, well, if we're going to give global licensing capabilities to Spotify, why wouldn't we give it to everybody else? So the commoditization of music, or at least the top 5,000 songs per year, is something that a lot of competition or a lot of the sort of other players have now access to globally. So then at that point, it becomes, well, how do we start to differentiate ourselves, right? And I think that's really the big question that a lot of people are asking. And there's really maybe 3 ways to differentiate yourself. 1 is distribution. 2 is having sort of a better product experience. So are you surfacing up playlists that are a lot more relevant to you, and things of that nature. And the 3rd is content differentiation. I mean, there are companies so Apple is doing really well in podcasts, and I would imagine Amazon is probably looking to do something fairly similar. So it's interesting in the audio space. In the content space, so like sort of in the Netflix world, it was fairly similar several years ago, until everybody started developing their own original content, which kind of made sense. But yeah, in the music space, they're kind of trying to figure that out right now.
Are there any markets that are, well, actually, I'll pose the question to you guys too. I mean, how do you try to muscle in on sort of local favorites that folks may have had around before, and they have a long-standing, it's just been part of their life for a long time, and you want to suggest something new, or give them a new way of seeing perhaps something in their own neighborhood or their own lifestyle or something like that. Once you've made the local pitch, right? Elizabeth, what do you think?
I mean, I think the same as both Ben and Patrick would say, making something relevant, whether that's talking to an audience in the voice they would talk to each other in, or making sure that if you're placing advertisement, it has to be relevant to the context that it's in. I feel like quick response to relevance is the best way to kind of move your way into some place that you're not. it's the kind of Zamboni, which is it needs to be incredibly smooth for it to kind of, show up into somebody's feed or social media or whatever. It has to seem completely obvious that it would be there. It cannot stick out. And I think any of the times that you can make something contextually relevant or that you can make it in the voice of where you are is the best way to do it. I'll give 2 quick stories that are really quick about that. One is we have a social media bullpen at the ad agency, which is something that ad agencies didn't have, I don't know, years ago, but definitely we've had for almost 5 or 6 years, which literally listen actively to the social media of our clients and then need to rapidly create content to respond to it. Tony Hawk a couple years back had an issue with one of his Lexuses when he took it in for service, and he was kind of tweeting about it and he was angry about it, and we were like, okay, how can we turn this around? Tony Hawk has a really neat demographic of followers that we would like a lot more people to kind of like Lexus from, and we really came down and helped with this issue he was having, and then asked if he'd want to jump over this kind of prototype vehicle that was worth somewhere around $2 million. We were like, okay, trust us again. We trust our skills again because we trust your skills so much. We will give you an opportunity to actually jump on your skateboard over this $2 million vehicle. And he was super down for it and thought it was really fun. And we created a video that was, posted within an hour of it. And automatically you're getting into audiences you hadn't gotten before, and you did it in an authentic way that resonated with them. And I think those kind of moments are when you're gonna get, kind of more than you ever expected. The second piece is just we had something with Japanese remote control car competitions, which are something I never knew anything about, but is a big deal. They do these kind of remote control car competitions in Japan, and we sent a few small, there's a car called the RC, the Lexus RC, it's like the sports car. We made RCs, so remote control RCs, and we sent them and let them do competitions. And we said, we're not gonna edit your YouTube videos, just if you'll be willing to make it, really let them make the content, we will post it on the Lexus channel. And we sent it to a few of the top performance RC drivers. The hits for that, the ability to move into this kind of really niche but very interesting market, you just make it relevant to the market, and that's your quickest way of coming into any place.
So as media groups expand internationally, I mean, this has been something that we've been tracking now for the year, really. Digiday, New York Times, Washington Post, BuzzFeed. I mean, they are going out into new markets like crazy. And even for companies like the New York Times, where they've been out in the world covering the world, they haven't been exploring business models for the world. But they're facing a lot of domestic competition. They're struggling with how much local versus global and all the stuff that we just talked about at the beginning. But what's your take on the competitive landscape? I mean, there's no one that really does stuff like you guys do. So how do you guys think about where you fit into people's lives like that?
Well, I mean, Vice's 2 founding tenets, right, were speak to audiences in the voice they speak to each other in. Thanks for the shout out, Liz. And then, and distribute content everywhere that they want to consume it. And what that means in very simple terms is you look at the platforms that they want to consume content on, and you make content available there, and you make sure that that content is something that they can take away cultural capital from, right? So I think it's less for us about an analysis of the local competitive market, and it's less about the tracking on a one-to-one basis the movements of competitors. It's more about how do we feed the 4 big sort of revenue centers that we have selling content to further to distributors for distribution on their channels, to subscribers of DTC and cable services, to advertisers who are looking to reach our audience, and to advertisers who are looking to harness our services. As long as we are continuing to feed great stories into those 4 channels, we are going to be a step ahead of the market because we have put the infrastructure in place to do that. And then also we are not going to spend too much time looking over our shoulders. And as Liz knows from her Nike days, when a runner starts looking over his shoulder, he's tired. So we're not going to look over our shoulders.
So real quick, I'm curious about which countries and territories would be like the most challenging and difficult to develop content for, to get that mix right. Elizabeth, I'm curious about this from your perspective because you've told me about your process of doing this. Are there any that just stand out as just being very, tricky?
China.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm like, I mean, the obvious answer is China. It's, it's so vast. It's so differentiated. China is a million different segments in itself. Saying if somebody says they're a China expert, I'm always like, which part of China? What aspect of China? Because it's a hard one. I mean, I think that's just my quick, easy answer. I don't know.
India, for the same reasons. I mean, specifically with either TV, movie content or music, the amount of sort of very unique cultures within the entire country makes it, just that much more difficult to scale, since it really isn't sort of a homogenous situation. But yeah.
So Ben, I'm taking you're saying China too, right? That's a big one.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we are in a very advantageous position in China because we've been there for a number of years, because we have a broadcast license, because we, have brought a lifetime of global acumen into that market, and so we kind of know where we can make business work. The challenge with China is just, the stories that you can tell and the ways that you can operate are different than they are in the rest of the world. And when you look at the size of the market, the opportunity of the market, you would like it to be as free and as open as the rest of the world is. But the Chinese, have a particular way of doing business, and we have to be respectful of that. So, yeah.
So what kind of data and information do you guys rely on to do what you do, right? I know in your case, Patrick, you've got the benefit of having just tons and tons of information coming through from listeners, and you've got people out in the markets who are taking a look at that, and it gets on up to you. How do you do it? How do you make it actionable? How do you make sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anything, the data is there to serve a purpose, right? And I think if you understand, or if there's clarity in terms of what that purpose is, then I think that informs everything else, right? And so there's this thing called sort of a North Star metric, and at least in Spotify's case or Netflix case, it's like monthly active users or monthly active subscribers. That basically informs everything else. It informs, we have all of this data. We have all of this data sliced by various cohorts, by market, by behavior, things of that nature. What are the sort of the path that these cohorts take to get to a point where they're using this service on a habitual level? And then, so there's two ways to get to that information. One is basic behavior, and two is, if you want to speed it up, is through experimentation. And both basically coexist with each other, because usually what happens is, if you find winners in your experiments, or you find something that's favorable, then you just sort of double down on that, and that then scales everywhere else. But yeah, I mean, that's for the most part, that's kind of how we use it. I mean, it's just massive amounts of information, but they've got to serve some sort of focus or some sort of purpose that everybody sort of agrees with.
I think for us, the other thing is we've gotten really good at using data-driven creative. So having dynamic ads that are running out there. An example would be Expedia. If you are in Chicago and you're searching for Aruba, and I know that you are part of a family, we'll dynamically serve kind of stitched on the fly ads that are, there's a scene of Chicago and it's snowy, and a scene of Aruba and it's sunny, and a family activity. And it sounds, fairly kind of templated, and it is to some extent, but it is also incredibly relevant to somebody who's like, God, I really have been thinking about leaving Chicago. It's miserable right now, and I'd love to take my family to Aruba. Having those, and I think the thing that I remember is somewhere in high school math, there was that ad, you were trained, maybe even junior high math, a junior high kid, I should remember this, where it's like you forget, figuring out versions of things, which is if I have 15 different destinations and 4 different types of, family, single, girls weekend, right away we're making tens of thousands of ads on the fly, and that's one of the best ways that we're using kind of data is making lots of context relevant, quick content, so the ads, speak to you in a way that isn't creepy, but is, kind of productive in getting a brand's message across.
This has been an important drive for the company, right? There's a lot of research and emphasis put on this right now, right?
Yeah.
So, Ben,
We just listen to really smart people.
no wonder you're here.
No data at all. No, I mean, look, obviously we have our own first-party data. We have, data that we get from our partners. We have third-party data that we get from commercial partners. But the other thing that we do is spend a lot of time listening. We have a panel of 35,000 Vice audience members who have opted in to have a dialogue with us and to share with us what they care about, and that the questions to them on a weekly basis vary dramatically from what did you eat for breakfast this morning to what do you think of the Khashoggi thing to who are you going out to see tonight from a music perspective. That sort of anecdotal qualitative thing is crucial because ultimately our appeal to people is cultural and driven by relevancy, and so we have to be, to exactly to Liz's point, as relevant as possible. We just we're doing it through conversation, not through sort of trying to put a transactional moment further up in the funnel. And yeah, so that's that. And and again, I mean, the more we listen, the better we're doing our jobs as storytellers and content creators.